Rome, August 1492. Behind a locked door, a handful of powerful men were deciding who would become the next pope. Outside, the streets waited. Inside, promises were being made. Church offices had a price. Political alliances had a price. Loyalty had a price. And one aging Spanish cardinal understood the system better than almost anyone alive. His name was Rodrigo de Borgia. For nearly 4 decades, he had watched popes rise and watched them die. He had watched powerful families flourish and then collapse. He had accumulated enormous wealth, cultivated allies across Europe, and built a network of influence that reached from Rome to Spain. He had also fathered children while wearing the robes of a cardinal. Now, at 61 years old, he was within reach of the most powerful office in Western Christendom. If he succeeded, the Borgia family would rise with him. If he failed, his enemies were waiting. Within a few years, his daughter Lucrezia would become one of the most notorious women in European history. His son Cesare would abandon the church for the sword and become one of the most formidable political figures of the Italian Renaissance. Another son would be murdered under mysterious circumstances, and Rodrigo himself would become Pope Alexander VI, a name that would eventually become almost inseparable from corruption, ambition, betrayal, scandal, and the legendary crimes of the Borgia family. But the truth is stranger than the legend, because Alexander VI was not simply a monster. He was also an extraordinarily capable administrator, diplomat, politician, patron, and survivor. He was a man who understood power. He understood money. He understood family. And he understood something perhaps even more important. He understood how to survive. To understand how such a man could become pope, and why the Borgia name became so feared, we have to go back before the palace, before the scandals, before the poisoned stories and whispered accusations. We have to go back to Spain. Welcome to Sated Past. If you enjoy deeply researched historical stories told as cinematic documentaries, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Like this video if you want more stories from the darker and more complicated corners of history. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Tonight, we are going into Renaissance Italy, into a world of magnificent churches and crowded streets, of powerful families and desperate beggars, of religious devotion and political calculation, of brilliant artists, ambitious princes, ruthless soldiers, and churchmen who sometimes behaved more like kings than priests. And at the center of this world stood one remarkable family, the Borgias. But before there was a Borgia dynasty, there was a boy. His name was Rodrigo. He was born in 1431 in Zativa, in the Kingdom of Valencia, then part of the Crown of Aragon. The Spain of Rodrigo's childhood was not yet the unified kingdom we imagine today. The Iberian Peninsula was divided among Christian kingdoms, Muslim territories, noble houses, merchants, soldiers, and competing political interests. For centuries, Christian and Muslim powers had fought, traded, negotiated, and lived beside one another across shifting frontiers. Religion mattered deeply, but so did survival. Families had to understand when to fight and when to negotiate. They had to recognize opportunity when it appeared. And they had to know that political circumstances could change very quickly. Rodrigo was born into a respectable family of the lesser nobility. His family had status, but not unlimited wealth. They had connections, but they were not among Europe's greatest dynasties. Rodrigo's father was Geoffrey de Borgia. His mother was Isabel de Borgia. And Isabel's brother was a man who would change the destiny of the entire family. His name was Alfonso de Borgia. Alfonso was a lawyer and churchman. He had served the Crown of Aragon and developed a reputation for administration and diplomacy. He understood the complicated world of law, church, government, negotiation, and royal politics. And in 15th century Europe, those skills could be extraordinarily valuable. The young Rodrigo grew up watching his uncle rise. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Power did not always belong to the strongest man. Sometimes it belonged to the man who understood the system. Sometimes it belonged to the man who knew whom to serve. And sometimes it belonged to the man who could turn one opportunity into 10 more. For an ambitious young man without an enormous inheritance, the church offered an extraordinary path upward. The church was a spiritual institution, certainly, But it was also one of the largest political and administrative organizations in Europe. It controlled land, it collected revenue, it maintained courts, it issued legal documents, it negotiated with kings, it appointed officials, and at its highest levels, it could provide a man with education, wealth, prestige, and political influence far beyond what his family background might otherwise allow. Rodrigo was suited to this world. He was intelligent, he was ambitious, and he possessed the social ability to move comfortably among powerful people. Then, in 1455, his uncle Alfonso de Borgia was elected pope. He took the name Calixtus III. For the Borgia family, everything changed. Suddenly, the relatives of a modest Spanish noble family were connected to the throne of St. Peter, and Rodrigo was about to receive the opportunity of a lifetime. Pope Calixtus III brought his nephew into the centre of papal politics. Rodrigo studied law at the University of Bologna, one of Europe's great centres of legal learning. He learned the language of institutions. He learned how authority worked. And he learned that the church was governed not only through theology, but through documents, procedures, appointments, negotiations, and carefully managed relationships. In 1456, when Rodrigo was about 25, Calixtus made him a cardinal. It was an extraordinary promotion. The College of Cardinals was one of the most powerful political bodies in Europe. The cardinals advised the Pope. They governed major parts of the church, and when a pope died, they would gather to choose his successor. Rodrigo was now one of them. The following year came an even more important appointment. Rodrigo became Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church. This position placed him at the heart of the papal bureaucracy. For decades, he would remain there, and that was perhaps more important than any single title. Because while other men might gain influence through temporary favour, Rodrigo was building something more durable. Experience, information, connections, money, and reputation. The papal chancery produced a constant stream of official documents, legal decisions, letters, appointments, dispensations, administrative orders. The machinery never stopped, and Rodrigo became exceptionally skilled at managing it. The income associated with his offices made him extremely wealthy. His household expanded, his influence expanded, his network expanded. But then, in 1458, the man who had opened all those doors died. Pope Calixtus III was gone, and suddenly Rodrigo discovered one of the oldest truths of politics. The protection of a dead ruler is worth very little. The Roman political establishment had resented the influence of the Spanish Borgias. With Calixtus dead, that resentment became easier to express. The family lost influence. Some of its members were attacked. Others were pushed aside. Rodrigo could have returned to Spain. He did not. He stayed in Rome. And he adapted. The new pope was Pius II, a scholar, diplomat, and humanist. He was very different from Calixtus. But Rodrigo understood something. He did not need every pope to love him. He only needed every pope to find him useful. So he remained useful. He worked. He negotiated. He administered. He avoided unnecessary confrontations. And he survived. Then another pope came, and another, and another. Paul II, Sixtus IV, Innocent VIII. Different personalities, different political factions, different ambitions. Yet Rodrigo remained. This became one of the defining characteristics of his career. He outlasted people. He outlasted factions. He outlasted scandals. He outlasted rivals. And while he waited, he became richer and more powerful. By the time he was an older man, Rodrigo de Borgia was no longer merely the nephew of a former pope. He was a major political force in Rome in his own right. His wealth allowed him to maintain an impressive household. His palace reflected his status. His connections reached across Italy and Spain. Kings knew him, cardinals knew him, ambassadors knew him, and ambitious men knew that Rodrigo could help them. He was generous when generosity served a purpose. He could be charming. He could be patient. And he possessed an unusual ability to remember details. Who had supported him? Who had betrayed him? Who owed him a favour? Who might become useful in the future? The longer he remained in power, the larger his network became. But there was another side to Rodrigo's life. A side that would eventually become central to the Borgia legend. He had children. As a cardinal, Rodrigo maintained relationships with women, most famously Vanosa Cattaneo. 4 children became especially important to his story: Cesar, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. These children were not simply hidden away from public life. Rodrigo took an active interest in their futures. He wanted them educated. He wanted them protected. And above all, he wanted them advanced. This was where his political ambition began to take on a dynastic character. Rodrigo had seen what happened when a pope died. The relatives of the previous pope could suddenly become vulnerable. Their offices could disappear. Their enemies could return. Their property could be challenged. Their influence could collapse. Rodrigo did not want that fate for his own family. He wanted something that would survive him. He wanted a dynasty, and his children would become the instruments through which he tried to build it. Cesar, the eldest of his most famous sons, was intelligent and ambitious. Rodrigo initially planned a church career for him. It was the same path Rodrigo himself had taken. Giovanni was destined for a secular and military career. Lucrezia, his daughter, would be used in the political world of dynastic marriage. Geoffrey would also become part of the family's alliance-building strategy. Each child had a role. Each marriage could create an alliance. Each title could create another source of power. And Rodrigo was already thinking several moves ahead. Yet despite all his wealth and influence, there was still one prize he had not obtained: the papacy. Twice, Rodrigo had watched papal elections unfold. Twice, he had learned from them. He observed how cardinals formed factions, how alliances shifted, how promises were made, how powerful men suddenly changed sides. He learned that the election of a pope was not simply a spiritual decision. It was also a political contest. And Rodrigo had spent more than 30 years preparing for that contest. Then, in 1492, Pope Innocent VIII died. The throne of St. Peter was vacant. The cardinals gathered in Rome. The conclave was about to begin. Rodrigo was 61 years old. He was wealthy, experienced, connected, patient, and ready. For decades, he had been learning how power worked. Now he was about to discover whether everything he had learned was enough to make him pope. The answer would come very soon. Inside the Vatican, the cardinals were preparing to enter conclave. For centuries, the election of a pope had been one of the most consequential political and religious events in Europe. The man chosen would not simply become the spiritual leader of millions of Christians. He would become the ruler of the papal states. He would control enormous revenues. He would appoint bishops and officials. He would influence kings. He would negotiate with princes. And he would possess the authority to shape the political balance of Italy. In 1492, that balance was already dangerously unstable. Italy was not a unified country. Instead, the peninsula was divided among powerful states. The Kingdom of Naples dominated the south. Milan controlled much of the north. Venice possessed a vast maritime empire. Florence was ruled under the growing influence of the Medici, and at the centre stood the Papal States, stretching across central Italy under the authority of the Pope. The great Italian powers competed constantly. They negotiated one year and threatened war the next. Marriage alliances could suddenly transform the political landscape. A death in one royal family could trigger a crisis thousands of miles away, and foreign monarchs were watching carefully. France was interested in Italy. Spain was interested in Italy. The Holy Roman Empire was interested in Italy. The Italian peninsula was wealthy, strategically important, and politically divided. For a man like Rodrigo de Borgia, this was an environment filled with opportunity. But the conclave would not be decided by Rodrigo alone. He needed votes, and there were many cardinals who had their own ambitions. One of the most important was Giuliano della Rovere. Giuliano was intelligent, forceful, and fiercely ambitious. He was also one of Rodrigo's greatest enemies. The rivalry between the two men would become one of the defining political conflicts of the coming years. But in the summer of 1492, neither man could know exactly how far that rivalry would eventually go. For now, the cardinals had to choose. The conclave began. The atmosphere was tense. The cardinals knew that whoever became pope would immediately inherit a dangerous political situation. And Rodrigo knew something else. He had spent decades cultivating relationships with these men. He had helped people. He had distributed favors. He had accumulated wealth. And wealth could be converted into influence. The election of a pope in Renaissance Rome was not conducted in the atmosphere of modern democratic elections. The cardinals were not campaigning before millions of voters. There were no public debates. There was no modern political party system. There were private negotiations, personal alliances, promises, pressure, and the expectation that powerful men would protect the interests of their own families and factions. Rodrigo understood this world perfectly. He knew that an election could turn on a single promise, a church office, a financial concession, a political alliance, a future appointment. And as the ballots were cast, Rodrigo's network began to work. The details of the election remained debated by historians. Later writers would portray the conclave as an almost theatrical marketplace of corruption. Some accusations became part of the Borgia legend. Others are difficult to verify. But one fact is certain. Rodrigo emerged victorious. On August 11th, 1492, he was elected pope. He chose the name Alexander VI. The 61-year-old cardinal had finally reached the summit. For decades, he had watched other men occupy the throne of St. Peter. Now he sat upon it himself. The transformation was enormous. Rodrigo Borgia had become Pope Alexander VI, and with his election, the political future of the Borgia family changed forever. But the new pope immediately faced a problem. Becoming pope was one thing. Remaining pope was another. His enemies had not disappeared. They had simply become more dangerous. Giuliano della Rovere had opposed his election. The della Rovere faction remained powerful. Italian rulers were watching. Foreign monarchs were calculating. And inside Rome, aristocratic families were asking a simple question. What would this Spanish pope do now that he possessed the full power of the papacy? The answer became visible almost immediately. Alexander began strengthening his position. He promoted men he trusted. He rewarded allies. He protected his family. And he began turning the papacy into the foundation of a much larger political project. His children would no longer be merely the children of a powerful cardinal. They were now the children of the Pope. That distinction changed everything. Caesar, who had already entered the church, was about to receive enormous opportunities. Giovanni was positioned for military and political advancement. Lucrezia would become an increasingly important instrument of dynastic diplomacy, and the Borgia family would begin its rapid transformation from an influential Spanish-Italian family into one of the most powerful houses in Renaissance Italy. But Alexander's election also created resentment. To many Italians, the arrival of another Spanish pope was deeply uncomfortable. The papacy was based in Rome. Its political power was deeply intertwined with Italian affairs, and yet the new pope came from a Spanish family that had risen rapidly through the church. The old Roman aristocracy had long memories. They remembered the Spanish influence of Calixtus III. They remembered the resentment that had followed. Now the Borgias were back, and this time they controlled the papal throne. Alexander understood the danger. He needed to make Rome feel that the papacy was secure. He needed allies among Italian princes. He needed to control the papal states. And he needed to ensure that his enemies could not unite against him. His first years as pope would therefore be dominated by diplomacy. And diplomacy, in Renaissance Italy, could be extraordinarily brutal. A treaty could prevent a war. A marriage could create an alliance. A marriage could also destroy one. A cardinal could become an ally. A cardinal could become an enemy. A fortress could protect a city. Or it could become a prison. Everything was connected. And Alexander had another concern: the Kingdom of Naples. For generations, the crown of Naples had been the object of competition between powerful European dynasties. The French monarchy had claims. The Spanish monarchy had interests. Italian rulers feared foreign intervention, and the Pope was caught directly in the middle. Alexander initially tried to maintain a balance, but balance in Renaissance politics was fragile. One wrong decision could invite invasion. One alliance could anger another power. And one ambitious monarch could decide that Italy was too valuable to leave alone. That monarch was Charles VIII of France. Charles was young, he was ambitious, and he believed he had a legitimate claim to the Kingdom of Naples. He began preparing to invade Italy. The consequences would be enormous, because when the French army crossed into Italy, the political world that Alexander had inherited would begin to unravel. The Renaissance would suddenly become a battlefield, and the Pope would have to decide whether to negotiate with the invader, resist him, or find another way to survive. Alexander chose survival. He opened negotiations. He tried to protect Rome. He watched the movements of the French army, and he searched for allies. But Charles VIII moved quickly. The French army was powerful, and as it advanced south, Italian rulers began to panic. Some changed sides. Others tried to remain neutral. Some opened their gates. Some prepared their defences. The political order of Italy was being tested by a foreign invasion, and Alexander found himself trapped between powerful forces. If he openly resisted France, he risked war with a major European monarchy. If he cooperated too closely with France, he risked losing the support of his Italian allies. And if he failed to protect Rome, his authority could be destroyed. The French army entered Italy. The shock was immediate. Charles's forces moved through the peninsula with remarkable speed. Italian states discovered that their old assumptions about warfare were changing. French artillery could smash fortifications that had previously seemed almost impregnable. The political structure of Italy was suddenly exposed. And in Rome, Alexander watched the danger approach. The Pope was not merely a religious leader hiding inside a palace. He was the ruler of a territory. He had enemies. He had soldiers. He had diplomats. And he had to make decisions that could determine whether his reign survived its first major crisis. Charles VIII eventually reached Rome. Alexander had to negotiate. The French king entered the city. For a moment, the future of the papacy looked uncertain. The Pope was under enormous pressure. But Alexander did what he had done throughout his career. He survived. He negotiated an agreement with Charles. The French king moved south toward Naples, and Alexander remained on the papal throne. But the crisis had revealed something important. The Borgia Pope could survive. Yet survival alone would not satisfy him. Alexander wanted more than security. He wanted power, and he wanted that power to protect his family. This is where Cesare Borgia enters the story. Cesare had been born in Rome around 1475. He was intelligent, educated, and ambitious. Alexander recognized his son's abilities. But there was a problem. Cesare was a churchman. He had been given a path toward the cardinalate. He was being prepared to follow his father into the highest levels of ecclesiastical power. At first, that seemed logical. A cardinal's son could be an extraordinary political asset to a pope. He could hold offices. He could negotiate. He could command respect. He could become the family's representative throughout Europe. But Cesare did not want to remain a cardinal forever. He wanted something else. He wanted power in the secular world. He wanted territory. He wanted armies. He wanted the freedom to build his own political state. And eventually, he would make a decision that shocked even the Renaissance world. He would abandon the church. But before Cesare could become the warrior prince remembered by history, Alexander needed to secure the Borgia position. His children needed marriages. His allies needed rewards. And the papal states needed to be brought under tighter control. The Pope began to build a new political order. Some of his actions were ordinary by Renaissance standards. Others were ruthless. Some were defensive. Others were openly ambitious. And the line between the two was often impossible to see. Lucrezia became part of this strategy. She was still very young, but her marriages would become important political instruments. Her first marriage was arranged with Giovanni Sforza, a member of the powerful Sforza family of Milan. The marriage was politically useful. The Borgias gained a connection to one of Italy's strongest dynasties, but the relationship would not last. Within a few years, the marriage would collapse, and the circumstances surrounding its annulment would become one of the most famous episodes in the Borgia story. Alexander's enemies would claim that Lucrezia had been used for scandalous purposes. Later writers would accuse her of almost unimaginable crimes. But much of the mythology surrounding Lucrezia was created or amplified long after her lifetime. The historical reality was more complicated. She was a young woman born into a political family. Her father controlled her marriages. Her brothers competed for influence. And powerful men around her were constantly making decisions that affected her life. She was not simply the legendary femme fatale of later literature. She was also a daughter caught inside a dangerous political machine. Meanwhile, Cesare was watching. He understood what his sister's marriage meant. He understood what his father's power could provide. And he understood that the Borgia family was becoming stronger. But he also understood something else. His own future was uncertain. As long as he remained a cardinal, he was tied to the church. His father could give him offices. He could give him money. But could he give him a kingdom? Cesare wanted more, and Alexander was about to give him the opportunity. The death of Giovanni Borgia would become the turning point. Giovanni was Alexander's son. He was young, he was ambitious, and he had been given an important military role. Then, in June 1497, he disappeared. He had been seen in Rome. Later that night, he was gone. The next day, his body was discovered in the Tiber. He had been stabbed. The murder shocked Rome. The Pope was devastated. Alexander reportedly mourned deeply, but the identity of the killer remained uncertain. Rumors spread immediately. Some accused enemies of the Borgia family. Others suspected political rivals. And soon, another accusation emerged. Cesare himself. Later stories would claim that Cesare had killed his brother because he wanted Giovanni's political position. But historians have never established that accusation as fact. There is no definitive evidence proving that Cesare murdered Giovanni. The mystery remains, and that mystery became one of the ingredients from which the Borgia legend was built. Because the story was irresistible. Two ambitious brothers, a powerful father, a beautiful sister, a murdered son, a family surrounded by enemies, and a pope who seemed willing to do almost anything to protect his dynasty. The reality was undoubtedly darker than a simple family drama, but the legend would become darker still. Giovanni's death changed Cesare's position. The church career that had once seemed inevitable now began to look like a prison. Cesare had seen his brother die. He had seen how quickly political fortunes could change. And he knew that if he remained tied entirely to the church, his own future would always depend upon his father's survival. He wanted his own power, his own army, his own territory, his own name. And soon he would take the most extraordinary step of his life. He would renounce the cardinal's hat. He would remove himself from the path of the church, and he would enter the world of war. But first, Alexander had to transform his son's ambition into a political reality. The opportunity would come from France, and the man who would make it possible was a new king, Louis XII. When Louis came to the French throne in 1498, he had his own ambitions in Italy. He wanted Milan, he wanted influence, and he had claims to Naples. Alexander saw an opportunity. The Pope could support the French king. The French king could support the Borgia family, and Cesare could become the bridge between them. It was a dangerous bargain. But Alexander had spent his entire career making dangerous bargains. Now the stakes were higher than ever. The Borgia family was no longer merely trying to survive. It was trying to build a state. And the man chosen to build it would be Cesare Borgia. By the summer of 1498, the political landscape of Europe had changed again. Louis XII had become King of France. And for Alexander VI, the arrival of a new French monarch created an opportunity. Louis wanted Italy, Alexander wanted security, and Cesare Borgia wanted something neither the church nor his father could give him by themselves, a state of his own. The plan began with diplomacy. Cesare was sent toward France. He carried with him the authority of his father. But he also carried something more valuable, a promise. Alexander would support Louis's ambitions in Italy. In return, the Borgia family expected French protection, and Cesare would receive the opportunity to abandon the ecclesiastical career that had been imposed upon him. In 1498, Cesare formally resigned his position as a cardinal. It was an extraordinary moment. For centuries, the cardinalate had been one of the highest positions a man could hope to achieve in the church. Cesare was giving it up. He was choosing politics over the priesthood, power over ceremony, the sword over the cross, and almost immediately, his transformation began. Louis XII granted Cesare the Duchy of Valentinois. The French king also helped arrange Cesare's marriage to Charlotte d'Albret, a member of the French royal family. Suddenly, Cesare was no longer merely the Pope's son. He was a secular prince, a French ally, a man with a title, a marriage alliance, and access to military power. But titles were not enough. Cesare wanted territory, and territory had to be conquered. The Papal States contained numerous towns and territories that were only loosely controlled by Rome. Some were ruled by local lords, some by families who had held power for generations. These rulers had become accustomed to independence. Alexander wanted them brought under stronger papal authority. Cesare would be the instrument. The first major campaigns began in northern Italy. Cesare moved against the rulers of the Romagna. The region was politically fragmented. Cities such as Imola and Forlì were controlled by powerful local dynasties. The most famous of these rulers was Caterina Sforza. Caterina was a formidable woman. She had already survived political crises, assassinations, sieges, and family conflicts. She was not easily intimidated. When Cesare's army approached, she prepared to resist. The campaign revealed a new Cesare. He was not merely a court politician. He could organize armies. He could recruit experienced commanders. He could use artillery. He could negotiate when necessary. And he could apply overwhelming force when negotiation failed. Imola fell. Forlì followed after fierce resistance. Caterina Sforza was captured. Cesare's reputation grew. And with every victory, the dream of a Borgia state appeared more realistic. But Cesare was not operating alone. His father supplied political legitimacy. France supplied military support, and Cesare assembled some of the most capable soldiers and commanders in Italy. Among them was a man named Michelotto Carella. He became one of Cesare's most trusted lieutenants. Another was Ramiro de Lorqua, a harsh administrator who would be placed in charge of Romagna. Cesare understood that conquest was only the beginning. A territory could be taken by force, but keeping it required administration. Taxes had to be collected. Roads had to be secured. Banditry had to be controlled. Officials had to be appointed. Justice had to be enforced. And local populations had to believe that the new ruler was capable of maintaining order. This is one reason the historical Cesare Borgia is more complicated than the legend. He was ruthless. But he was also an effective political organizer. He wanted to transform conquered territories into a functioning state. And in this effort, he relied on a combination of fear, efficiency, and calculated mercy. But fear could become dangerous. In Romagna, Ramiro de Lorqua imposed strict order. His methods were severe. Crime declined. Disorder was suppressed. But the population began to resent him. Cesare understood the political problem. If he simply dismissed Ramiro, people might interpret it as weakness. If he kept him, resentment could eventually be directed against Cesare himself. So Cesare chose another solution. In December 1502, Ramiro was suddenly arrested. He was executed. His body was displayed publicly in the square at Cesena. The message was unmistakable. The Borgia government could be ruthless. But Cesare, not Ramiro, controlled the violence. It was an extraordinary political performance. The people of Romagna could see that the brutal administrator had been punished. At the same time, Cesare demonstrated that he alone possessed final authority. Years later, Niccolo Machiavelli would observe Cesare Borgia closely. Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat. He met Cesare. He watched his campaigns. He studied his methods. And when Machiavelli later wrote The Prince, Cesare became one of the examples he used when discussing political power. Machiavelli did not portray Cesare as morally virtuous. That was not the point. He studied him as a political actor, a man who understood that rulers sometimes had to act decisively, a man who understood that fear could be useful, a man who understood that timing mattered. But Cesare's greatest weakness was also becoming obvious. His power depended heavily on his father. As long as Alexander remained pope, Cesare had access to papal money, papal legitimacy, papal alliances, and papal authority. If Alexander died, everything could change. That possibility haunted the entire Borgia project. The family was building power at extraordinary speed. But the foundation remained one man, Alexander. And Alexander was getting older. He was also becoming increasingly involved in the struggle for control of Italy. The French were advancing. The Spanish were expanding their influence. Milan had fallen to French power. Naples was contested, and the Papal States were being transformed. The Borgia family stood at the centre of all these conflicts. But the more powerful the family became, the more enemies it created. One of those enemies was the Orsini family. The Orsini were one of the most powerful aristocratic houses in Rome. They had survived generations of papal politics. They had their own fortresses, their own soldiers, their own alliances, and they were not prepared to surrender their independence simply because a Spanish pope had decided to strengthen papal authority. For years, Alexander had attempted to manage the Roman barons, but Cesare's expansion in central Italy threatened their interests directly. The Orsini and other nobles began to fear that the Borgias intended to destroy their power completely. In 1502, opposition began to harden. Several military commanders who had previously served Cesare became increasingly uneasy. They believed Cesare's ambitions were becoming too great, and some began to consider turning against him. Cesare responded with patience. He did not immediately attack. Instead, he watched. He negotiated. He allowed his enemies to believe that he was willing to compromise, and he waited for them to gather in one place. This was the conspiracy that became known as the Magione conspiracy. The conspirators met at Magione, near Perugia. Among them were powerful figures who feared Cesare's expansion. They discussed how to stop him. For a moment, it appeared that Cesare's entire project might collapse. His commanders could defect. His enemies could unite. His French support might not be enough. And if his enemies struck together, Cesare could lose everything he had conquered. But Cesare did not panic. Instead, he negotiated. He offered terms. He appeared willing to reconcile. He understood that his enemies were divided by their own ambitions. They did not all want the same thing. Some wanted Cesare destroyed. Some wanted their territories protected. Some wanted money. Some wanted revenge. And some simply wanted to survive. Cesare exploited those divisions. He bought time. He separated his opponents. And then he struck. The conspiracy collapsed. Several of the conspirators were persuaded to return to his service. Others were defeated. But Cesare understood that one problem remained. The men who had betrayed him were too dangerous to leave alive. And so the final phase of the crisis began. Cesare invited several of his former commanders to meet him at Sinigalia. They believed they were going to negotiate. Instead, they were arrested. The event became famous as the massacre of Sinigalia. Cesare had successfully eliminated several of the men who had threatened his power. The episode demonstrated something fundamental about him. He was not simply reacting to events. He was planning them. He was willing to wait weeks or months for the right moment. He could appear weak while preparing to become stronger. He could negotiate with a man one day and have him arrested the next. And he could transform political uncertainty into an advantage. But the Borgia story was about to become even darker, because while Cesare was building his state, Lucrezia was being used to build alliances. Her marriage to Giovanni Sforza had already collapsed. The official explanation was that Giovanni was incapable of consummating the marriage, but rumours spread that the annulment had been politically motivated. The Sforza alliance was no longer as useful to Alexander as it once had been, so the marriage had to end. Lucrezia was placed in an increasingly important position. Her father arranged another marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscay. Alfonso was connected to the royal house of Naples. The marriage strengthened the Borgia connection to the Aragonese faction. But Italian politics changed quickly. French influence was growing. Spanish influence was growing. And the alliance that had once made Alfonso useful could suddenly make him dangerous. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked in Rome. He survived the first assault. But the danger did not disappear. He was attacked again. This time, he died. The circumstances surrounding his death immediately produced rumours. Some suspected Cesare. Others suspected political rivals. The official story was complicated. The truth remains uncertain. But the pattern was becoming familiar. Whenever a Borgia rival died unexpectedly, suspicion followed, and every new mystery strengthened the family's reputation. Poison, assassination, incest, betrayal. The Borgia name was becoming a magnet for stories of corruption. Some were based on real events, some were exaggerations, some were invented, and some remain mysteries. The historical challenge is separating the family that actually existed from the family created by centuries of hostile writers. Alexander's enemies had every reason to portray him as uniquely evil. He was a foreigner in Rome. He had openly promoted his children. He had used papal resources to strengthen his family. He had enemies among powerful Italian nobles. And his personal life violated the ideals expected of a Renaissance pope. His opponents could point to these contradictions and construct a powerful narrative. The Pope, who was supposed to be the spiritual father of Christendom, had created a political dynasty around his own children. To his enemies, that was proof of corruption. To Alexander, it was survival. But the more the Borgias expanded, the more dangerous their enemies became. And one of those enemies was already watching from the shadows, Giuliano della Rovere. He had opposed Alexander's election. He had been forced into exile. He had watched the Borgia family grow stronger, and he was waiting for his opportunity. He would eventually become Pope Julius II. And when that happened, the relationship between the della Rovere family and the Borgias would become one of the most consequential rivalries in Renaissance politics. But Alexander still had another problem. His enemies were not limited to cardinals and Italian nobles. The great European powers were also watching. France wanted Italy. Spain wanted Italy, and the papacy was caught between them. Alexander had used French power to strengthen Caesar, but France was not the only power capable of changing the balance. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united their kingdoms and were expanding Spanish influence across Europe. Their armies had conquered Granada only a few years earlier. Their attention was turning outward, and the Italian peninsula was becoming one of the great prizes of European politics. Alexander had been born in Valencia. He understood Spain. He understood the ambitions of its monarchs. And he understood that the Borgia family's survival might ultimately depend on maintaining the right relationship with Spain. The political game was becoming more dangerous. Every alliance created another enemy. Every victory created another rival. Every marriage created another obligation. And every territory Cesare conquered made the Borgia family more threatening. By 1503, Cesare's position appeared stronger than ever. He controlled much of Romagna. His military reputation was growing. His political network was expanding. And his father still sat on the papal throne. The Borgia dream seemed close to becoming permanent. Then came August. Alexander was in Rome. Cesare was with him. And suddenly, both father and son fell violently ill. The Pope's condition deteriorated rapidly. Rumours immediately spread through Rome. Poison. Some said the Borgias had poisoned themselves. Others said their enemies had poisoned them. Still, others believed disease was responsible. The truth would become one of the great mysteries of the Borgia story. But one fact was undeniable. Alexander VI was dying. And if he died, the entire political structure his family had built could collapse. Cesare understood that immediately. His father's survival was not simply a family matter. It was the foundation of his own power. Without Alexander, the papal resources that supported Cesare could disappear. His enemies could return. His territories could revolt. His alliances could dissolve. And the man who had spent years building a state might lose everything in a matter of weeks. The Pope's condition worsened. On August 18th, 1503, Alexander VI died. He was 72 years old. The man who had risen from a Spanish noble family to the throne of St. Peter was gone. And with his death, the Borgia family entered its most dangerous moment. Because the real test of power is not how strong a ruler appears while he is alive. It is what remains after he dies. And for the Borgias, almost everything was about to change. The Borgia family had spent more than a decade building power around one man. Now that man was dead. And the consequences were immediate. Rome changed almost overnight. The same families that had feared Alexander suddenly saw an opportunity. The same cardinals who had remained cautious now began calculating their next moves. The enemies of the Borgias emerged from hiding, and Cesare, once protected by the immense authority of his father, suddenly discovered how fragile his position really was. He was ill himself. His armies were scattered. His enemies were gathering, and the papal government that had supplied much of his political strength was about to pass into different hands. For Cesare, there was no time to mourn. He needed to survive. The first problem was the election of Alexander's successor. The cardinals assembled again, and this time the Borgia influence was greatly reduced. The man who had controlled the papacy for more than a decade was gone. Cesare could no longer command the same obedience. The political world was already moving beyond him. A short-lived pope, Pius III, was elected, but Pius was already seriously ill. His reign lasted only a matter of weeks. Then, in October 1503, the cardinals gathered again. This time, the result would be far more important. Giuliano della Rovere was elected pope. He took the name Julius II. For Cesare Borgia, this was a disaster. Julius had been one of Alexander's greatest enemies. He had spent years opposing the Borgia family. Now he occupied the throne of St. Peter. The man who had once been hunted by Borgia political power now controlled the institution that had created that power. Julius understood the situation immediately. The papal states needed to be reclaimed. Borgia territories needed to be recovered. Cesare's political network had to be dismantled, and the influence of the Borgia family had to be reduced. Cesare attempted to negotiate. He still possessed troops. He still had allies. But his position was deteriorating. Without his father's protection, the foundations of his power began to crack. Cities that had submitted to him began to reconsider. Local rulers who had feared his army began to resist, and commanders who had depended upon Borgia money began to wonder whether they should remain loyal. Power is often less solid than it appears. As long as the center is strong, the edges obey. When the center weakens, the edges begin to pull away. That was happening now. Cesare attempted to move toward Naples, but the political situation there had changed. France and Spain were now fighting over the kingdom. The Borgia family had once benefited from French support, but France could no longer guarantee Cesare's future. Spain was becoming increasingly dominant, and Cesare found himself caught between forces much larger than himself. He was eventually arrested. His enemies had finally found the opportunity they had been waiting for. The man who had conquered cities now had to negotiate for his own freedom. But even then, Cesare refused to disappear quietly. He escaped. He travelled through Italy and eventually sought refuge with his brother-in-law, Jean d'Albret, King of Navarre. For a brief period, Cesare found himself outside the world of Italian politics. But he was not finished. He still possessed ambition. He still possessed military experience, and he still believed he could recover his position. Then another opportunity appeared. Navarre was involved in conflict with rebellious nobles. Cesare joined the campaign. In March 1507, while fighting near Viana, he was killed. He was only 31 years old. The man who had once seemed destined to become one of the most powerful rulers in Italy died far from Rome, far from the papal court, far from the territories he had conquered. His body was buried at Viana. The career of Cesare Borgia had ended, but his reputation had only begun. Years later, historians and writers would continue to argue over him. Was he a ruthless tyrant? A brilliant military commander? A political genius? A failed prince? A victim of circumstances? The answer depends on which part of his life we examine. He was certainly capable of cruelty. He was responsible for political violence. He ordered executions. He eliminated enemies. But he also understood administration. He attempted to impose order on territories that had suffered from local conflict. He recruited capable officials. He used diplomacy as effectively as military force. And he understood the importance of controlling information and perception. His greatest weakness was the same thing that had made his rise possible. His power was connected to his father. When Alexander died, Cesare's political foundation weakened dramatically. Without the papacy behind him, he was forced to build a state with resources that were no longer guaranteed. He could conquer territory, but he could not make the political world remain still. And while Cesare's story ended in 1507, Lucrezia's life continued. In fact, the woman who had become one of the most notorious figures in Borgia mythology would go on to live a very different life from the one imagined by later storytellers. After the death of Alfonso of Aragon, Lucrezia married Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Este family of Ferrara. This marriage was politically important. Ferrara was one of the major cultural centres of Renaissance Italy. The Este court attracted poets, artists, musicians, scholars, and diplomats. Lucrezia entered that world as a political bride. But over time, she developed a reputation of her own. She became a patron of the arts. She maintained a sophisticated court. She corresponded with important figures. And she became far more than the helpless pawn of her father's political ambitions. Yet the old rumours followed her. Stories of incest, stories of murder, stories of poison, stories of secret lovers. Some of these stories were promoted by political enemies. Others were created generations later. The image of Lucrezia as a deadly Borgia temptress became especially popular in the 19th century. Romantic writers were fascinated by the Borgias. They transformed a complicated Renaissance family into something almost Gothic. The historical Lucrezia was much harder to understand. She was a woman living inside a world where marriage could determine the fate of entire states. Her father could arrange her marriage. Her brothers could change her political position. Her husbands could be allies one year and liabilities the next. She had limited control over the forces surrounding her. Yet she eventually built a life in Ferrara that was far more stable than the chaotic years of her youth. She died in 1519 at the age of 39. Her life had been marked by political manipulation, personal loss, childbirth, diplomacy, and court life. But she left behind something very different from the legend, a reputation as a capable Renaissance noblewoman and patron. The Borgia family, however, did not vanish immediately. Alexander's other children survived, but the dynasty he had imagined never became the permanent Italian power he wanted. That raises one of the most important questions about Alexander's reign. If he was as powerful and capable as his supporters believed, why did the Borgia political project collapse so quickly after his death? The answer is simple. It depended too heavily on personal power. Alexander had created a network centered on himself. He could reward allies. He could threaten enemies. He could use papal offices. He could command the resources of the church. He could negotiate with kings. And he could use Cesare as his military instrument. But institutions are stronger than individuals. A political dynasty requires more than a powerful father. It requires a stable succession. It requires territory. It requires loyal elites. It requires money that can survive a change of ruler. And most importantly, it requires legitimacy. The Borgias never fully achieved those things. Alexander's greatest political achievement was therefore also his greatest weakness. He had created extraordinary power very quickly, but he had not created a system capable of surviving him. And the man who replaced him, Julius II, had every reason to destroy what remained. Julius was not content merely to survive. He wanted to restore papal authority over central Italy. He personally led military campaigns. He negotiated with kings. He changed alliances. And he became one of the most formidable warrior popes of the Renaissance. In many ways, Julius's reign represented the opposite of the Borgia strategy. Alexander had tried to build family power through the papacy. Julius tried to strengthen the territorial power of the papacy itself. He wanted the papal states to function as a real political entity. He wanted Rome to be feared. And he wanted foreign powers to understand that the Pope could also be a military ruler. But the Borgia legacy remained. The papacy had changed. The political map had changed. Yet the stories surrounding Alexander continued to grow. There were accusations that he had used poison. There were stories that the Borgia family had perfected a secret poison capable of killing a victim without leaving obvious traces. There were claims that Alexander had murdered cardinals. There were accusations of sexual depravity. There were stories of incest involving Cesare and Lucrezia. There were tales of elaborate orgies inside the Vatican. And there were stories that Alexander had even arranged murders for financial gain. The problem is that many of these stories appeared in hostile sources. Some were written by political enemies. Some were repeated decades after the events. Some became increasingly extravagant as they were retold. That does not mean that Alexander was innocent of corruption. He was not. He openly practiced nepotism. He used papal authority to advance his family. He maintained relationships that violated clerical ideals. He participated in political intrigue. He supported military campaigns. He accumulated enormous wealth. And he treated the papacy as both a spiritual office and a political institution. But the leap from corruption to every crime attributed to him is not historically justified. This distinction matters, because history is not simply the collection of the darkest stories ever told about a person. It is the process of asking which stories can be supported, which claims come from contemporary evidence, which accusations were political propaganda, and which stories became legends long after the people involved were dead. Alexander's reputation suffered from all three. His enemies hated him. His lifestyle scandalized many observers, and later generations found the Borgia story irresistible. The family seemed to embody everything that modern audiences imagined about the Renaissance: luxury, violence, sex, politics, religion, power, and betrayal. But the Renaissance itself was more complicated. It was not simply an age of corruption. It was also an age of extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievement. The same Italy that produced political violence also produced some of Europe's greatest artists. Leonardo da Vinci was alive during Alexander's reign. Michelangelo was beginning his career. The printing press was transforming the spread of knowledge. Humanist scholars were rediscovering ancient texts. European powers were expanding their horizons. And in 1492, the same year Alexander became Pope, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic under the sponsorship of Ferdinand and Isabella. The world was changing. Europe was moving toward the early modern age, and Alexander sat directly at the intersection of the old world and the new. He was a medieval-style pope operating in an increasingly modern political environment. He governed territory. He negotiated with monarchs. He used family alliances. He supported military campaigns. But he also presided over a church that was becoming increasingly connected to global political changes. Only a few years after his death, Martin Luther would challenge the Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation would begin. Europe would enter another era of religious conflict. The world of Alexander would slowly disappear. But before that transformation, another event would give his reign a significance that reached far beyond his family. In 1493, Alexander issued a series of papal decisions concerning the newly encountered lands across the Atlantic. The voyages of Columbus had opened a new chapter in European expansion. The Pope became involved in defining spheres of influence between Spain and Portugal. The resulting papal bulls helped establish the diplomatic framework that contributed to the Treaty of Tordesillas. This was a reminder that the papacy was not merely concerned with Italian politics. It was involved in decisions that affected the entire Christian European world. The Pope could influence exploration. He could influence diplomacy. He could influence war. And he could influence the legal and religious framework through which European monarchies justified expansion overseas. Alexander's papacy, therefore, cannot be reduced to the story of his children. His reign was part of a much larger transformation. Europe was becoming more centralized. Monarchies were becoming stronger. Military technology was changing. Printing was accelerating communication. And overseas exploration was connecting Europe to lands and peoples previously unknown to most Europeans. The Renaissance was becoming the early modern world. Alexander lived at the center of that transformation, and yet his name is remembered mostly for the Borgias. That is partly because his family story is so dramatic, but it is also because his personal contradictions are so striking. He was a pope who fathered children, a spiritual leader who behaved like a Renaissance prince, a man who could commission religious art while participating in political intrigue, a diplomat who could negotiate peace and support war, a patron of culture who was surrounded by scandal, and a father who tried to create a dynasty using the most powerful institution in Western Christendom. That contradiction is the heart of Alexander's story. He was not an impossible exception. He was a product of his age, but he was also exceptionally successful at exploiting its weaknesses. And that is why the Borgia story survived. Not because every rumor was true, but because enough of the reality was extraordinary. There really was a pope who openly advanced his children. There really was a son who abandoned the cardinalate to become a warrior prince. There really were political murders around the family. There really were alliances built through marriage. There really was a struggle for territory in central Italy. There really was a pope whose death threatened to destroy his family's political project. The legend grew because the foundation was real. And perhaps that is what makes Alexander VI so fascinating. The truth does not need every myth. The real story is already remarkable enough. But there is still one final question. Why did Alexander behave this way? Was he simply greedy? Was he corrupt? Was he trying to build a dynasty for its own sake? Or did he believe that strengthening his family was the only way to protect the papacy from the powerful forces surrounding it? The answer may lie in the world that created him. Rodrigo de Borgia had grown up watching political power rise and disappear. He had seen his uncle become pope. He had seen the family's protection vanish when that pope died. He had survived because he adapted. For decades, he learned that nothing was permanent. And perhaps that lesson shaped everything he did as pope. He wanted security. He wanted control. He wanted his children protected. He wanted allies who would remain loyal. And he wanted the Borgia name to survive after him. In that sense, Alexander's greatest fear may have been the same fear that haunted every Renaissance ruler. What happens when you are gone? The answer came quickly. Alexander died in August 1503. Caesar's power collapsed. The Borgia territories were reclaimed. Lucrezia moved into a different political world, and the family never became the permanent dynasty Alexander had imagined. His ambition had reached enormous heights. But history proved that personal power is fragile. A ruler can build a palace. He can command an army. He can control a government. He can arrange marriages. He can buy loyalty. But eventually, he dies. And when the man at the center disappears, everyone who depended upon him begins to calculate again. The Borgias learned that lesson brutally. Their rise had been extraordinary. Their fall was almost as rapid. And centuries later, their name would still be whispered as though it belonged to a family of monsters. But behind the legend were real people, ambitious people, frightened people, political people. People trying to survive in a world where the line between religion and power was almost impossible to separate. Alexander VI was not the only corrupt pope of the Renaissance. He was not the only ruler who used family connections. He was not the only prince who ordered political violence. But he became the symbol of all of it, because his family made the contradiction visible. The Borgia story showed what could happen when the highest spiritual office in Europe became the center of a family's political ambitions. And that is why Alexander's reign still fascinates us. Not because he was uniquely evil, but because he reveals how power actually worked, how institutions could be captured by individuals, how families could become political machines, how propaganda could transform real events into legends, and how, sometimes, the truth lies somewhere between the saint and the monster. The Pope died, the dynasty failed, the legend survived, and in the centuries that followed, Alexander VI would become one of the most controversial names in the history of the papacy. But the story of the Borgias was not finished with his death. The world that had produced them was changing. A new generation of popes would rise. New wars would reshape Italy. New religious movements would challenge Rome. And within a few decades, Europe would enter one of the greatest religious crises in its history. The Renaissance world of Alexander VI was approaching its end, and the age that followed would be even more turbulent. The death of Alexander had ended one chapter of the Borgia story, but it had not ended the consequences of his reign. Across Italy, political leaders were already adjusting to the new reality. The Borgia territories were being reclaimed. Caesar's enemies were returning, and the papacy was moving in a completely different direction under Julius II. For the Borgias, the age of expansion was over. For Rome, however, a new struggle was beginning. Julius was determined to restore the authority of the papal states. He wanted cities that had slipped from papal control. He wanted rebellious rulers removed. And he wanted the Pope to be feared not merely as a spiritual authority, but as a political sovereign. This was the world into which the memory of Alexander disappeared. But history did not forget him. Instead, it began to transform him. The man himself became separated from the stories told about him. One generation repeated an accusation. The next added another. A political insult became a historical anecdote, an unproven rumour became a certainty. And eventually, the Borgia family became one of the most famous examples of Renaissance corruption. The poison stories were particularly powerful. According to later legends, the Borgias possessed mysterious poisons capable of killing almost anyone. A drop in a cup, a poisoned ring, a specially prepared apple, a secret powder. The stories were dramatic. But there is no reliable evidence that the family possessed the almost supernatural poison described in popular literature. Poison certainly existed in Renaissance Italy. Political murder certainly existed. But the legendary Borgia poison belongs largely to the world of later storytelling. The same is true of many stories about Lucrezia. She has often been portrayed as a woman who participated enthusiastically in her family's crimes. Yet the surviving evidence does not support the image of Lucrezia as the murderous poisoner of popular fiction. She was born into a family where political decisions were made by powerful men. Her marriages were arranged for political purposes. Her life was repeatedly disrupted by events she did not control. And after arriving in Ferrara, she developed a much more stable and respected existence. She became a patron. She supported artists and poets. She participated in court life. She raised children. She corresponded with important figures. And she survived long enough to see the Borgia name lose much of its political power. Her life reveals one of the central problems with the Borgia legend. It is much easier to remember a villain than a complicated human being. The same problem exists with Alexander. He was certainly ambitious. He was certainly corrupt by many standards. His nepotism was obvious. He promoted relatives. He accumulated wealth. He used political marriages. He involved the papacy in dynastic strategy. But he also governed. He negotiated. He maintained diplomatic relationships. He supported church administration. He dealt with European monarchies. And he operated in a political system where almost every major ruler used family connections to expand power. The difference was that Alexander's family life was unusually visible. He had children. Those children received titles and marriages. His enemies could point to them as evidence of scandal. And because he was Pope, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. The spiritual head of the Catholic Church had become the center of a family political machine. That contradiction made Alexander unforgettable. But there was another reason his story survived. The Renaissance itself became romanticized. Later generations imagined Renaissance Italy as a place of secret passages, masked assassins, magnificent palaces, forbidden affairs, hidden poisons, and ruthless princes. The Borgias seemed to fit perfectly into that imagined world. Their story was almost too perfect. A Spanish pope, beautiful children, political marriages, murdered relatives, powerful enemies, warrior princes, poison rumours, and a papal court filled with intrigue. Writers could take these ingredients and create almost any story they wanted. And they did. Centuries later, novels, plays, paintings, films, and television dramas would continue to reinvent the family. Some portrayals made Lucrezia a victim. Others made her a criminal. Some portrayed Cesare as a genius. Others made him a monster. Alexander could be presented as a cynical politician, a corrupt priest, or an almost demonic figure. The historical record is much less convenient. It contains contradictions. It contains uncertainty. It contains evidence that sometimes points in different directions. And that is precisely what makes the real story worth studying. History is rarely clean. People do not behave according to simple categories. A ruler can be generous toward one person and ruthless toward another. A politician can sincerely believe he is protecting his country while also pursuing personal ambition. A parent can love his children and still use them as political instruments. Alexander appears to have genuinely cared about his family. But that affection did not prevent him from using his children for political purposes. Cesare loved his family, but he also ordered executions. Lucrezia suffered because of her family's ambitions. Yet she also became part of the political world created by those ambitions. The Borgia story is therefore not simply about evil. It is about power, and power changes people. It changes relationships. It changes the meaning of loyalty. It changes what a family is willing to do for survival. For Alexander, the papacy was both a religious responsibility and a source of political power. He inherited a world in which popes could command armies, negotiate treaties, appoint rulers, and control territory. He did not invent that system, but he exploited it aggressively. And that is why historians continue to debate his reign. Was Alexander unusually corrupt? Or was he simply unusually visible? Was the Borgia family exceptionally immoral? Or were they simply better documented and more successfully demonized? The answer is probably somewhere between those extremes. Alexander was not innocent, but neither was every accusation true. The real Borgia family was complicated enough without the myths. Consider Cesare. He was ruthless. Yet he also understood government. He wanted to create order in Romagna. He appointed administrators. He attempted to suppress local disorder. He wanted roads protected and taxes collected. He understood that a territory could not survive on military conquest alone. He needed institutions. This is one of the reasons Machiavelli admired his political methods. Machiavelli did not admire Cesare because he believed Cesare was morally good. He admired him because Cesare understood the mechanics of power. He understood that hesitation could be fatal. He understood that enemies had to be divided. He understood that mercy could sometimes be useful. And he understood that reputation could be as powerful as an army. But Machiavelli also saw Cesare's fatal weakness. His fortune depended on circumstances he could not control. Most importantly, his power depended on his father's papacy. When Alexander died, Cesare lost the foundation of his political strength. This was a lesson that Machiavelli would repeatedly emphasize. A ruler must build power that belongs to him. Power borrowed from another person can disappear as quickly as it arrives. Caesar had built an impressive state, but he had not built it on a foundation strong enough to survive the death of Alexander. That was why his achievements disappeared so rapidly, and that was why the Borgia political dynasty failed. Alexander had tried to transform personal influence into hereditary power, but the papacy was not a hereditary monarchy. The Pope could promote his family. He could give them land. He could arrange marriages. He could make his children rich. But he could not make one of them Pope simply because he was his son. Every papal death opened the political system again. Every new Pope could reverse the policies of his predecessor. The Borgia family therefore faced a structural problem. Their greatest source of power was temporary, and temporary power is dangerous when used to build permanent ambitions. Julius II understood this perfectly. He dismantled the Borgia position, he reclaimed territories, he reduced the influence of their allies, and he redirected papal power toward his own goals. Under Julius, Rome became the center of a new political project. The Pope himself became a warrior. He appeared on campaign. He negotiated with kings. He personally participated in military strategy. He wanted to strengthen the Papal States, and he wanted Italy to remain politically relevant in a Europe increasingly dominated by France and Spain. The irony was striking. Alexander had been condemned for behaving too much like a prince. Julius behaved like an even more obvious prince. But history remembered them differently. Alexander became the corrupt Borgia Pope. Julius became the warrior Pope and one of the great patrons of the High Renaissance. The difference was partly political. Julius's enemies did not win the same battle for his historical reputation. Alexander's did, and reputation can become a second life. Sometimes it is more powerful than the first. The Borgia reputation survived because it was useful. For political opponents, it demonstrated the dangers of nepotism. For Protestant writers, it could become evidence of Catholic corruption. For later anti-clerical writers, Alexander could represent everything they disliked about religious power. For novelists, the family offered endless drama. For filmmakers, they offered violence and intrigue. And for modern audiences, they remain fascinating because their story forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when people who claim moral authority behave like ordinary political rulers? That question does not belong only to the Renaissance. It appears throughout history. Institutions can be noble in principle while being controlled by imperfect people. Leaders can represent ideals that they personally fail to live up to. And the greater the institution's authority, the more dramatic the contradiction becomes. Alexander's story therefore matters beyond the Borgia family. It tells us something about institutions, it tells us something about ambition, and it tells us something about memory, because historical memory is not created only by facts. It is created by the stories people choose to repeat. The Borgia family became a story. Then the story became a legend. Then the legend became almost impossible to separate from history. But if we strip away the most dramatic myths, something remarkable remains. A young Spanish nobleman entered the church. His uncle became pope. He rose through the bureaucracy. He became extraordinarily wealthy. He survived multiple papacies. He built a network of allies. He entered the papal election of 1492. He won. He became Alexander VI. He promoted his children. He negotiated with kings. He survived a French invasion. He supported the creation of a Borgia state. His son became one of the most famous political figures of the Renaissance. His daughter became a powerful Renaissance duchess. And after his death, the entire project collapsed. That is not a legend. That is history. And history is already dramatic enough. But there is one final part of the Borgia story that deserves attention. The world changed after Alexander. The papacy itself would face a crisis of legitimacy. The Renaissance would reach extraordinary artistic heights. And then religious conflict would tear Western Christianity apart. Within a few decades, a German monk named Martin Luther would challenge the authority of Rome. The Reformation would begin. The Catholic Church would respond with reforms of its own. And the age of the Renaissance popes would gradually become a memory. Alexander's papacy belonged to the final generation before that transformation. He lived at the edge of two worlds. Behind him was the medieval papacy, with its feudal politics and territorial ambitions. Ahead of him was the early modern world, with stronger monarchies, mass printing, religious reform, global exploration, and increasingly centralized states. He stood in the middle, and perhaps that is the best way to understand him. Not as a monster, not as a saint, but as a Renaissance ruler who possessed extraordinary power and used it according to the political logic of his age. His greatest achievement was his rise. His greatest failure was his inability to make that rise permanent. His greatest weapon was political adaptability. His greatest weakness was that his family depended too heavily on him. And his greatest legacy was not a dynasty. It was a legend powerful enough to survive 5 centuries. The name Borgia still carries a strange weight. Say it, and people immediately imagine intrigue. Say Alexander, and the image of the corrupt pope appears. Say Cesare, and the warrior prince emerges. Say Lucrezia, and the myths of poison and scandal return. But behind those names were human beings. They loved. They feared. They made mistakes. They pursued ambition. They suffered loss. And they lived inside a world where politics was often inseparable from family. That world is gone. The palaces remain. The churches remain. The paintings remain. The documents remain. But the people who once whispered in Roman corridors are silent. Their decisions survive only through the traces they left behind. And among those traces, few stories are as powerful as the rise and fall of the Borgia family. Alexander VI wanted to make his family permanent. He failed. But in another sense, he succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. He became unforgettable. His enemies tried to destroy his reputation. Instead, they helped create one of the most enduring legends of Renaissance history. The Pope died. His dynasty collapsed. His enemies took back his territories. His son died in a foreign land. His daughter built a new life far from Rome. And yet the Borgia name survived. Not as a kingdom, not as a dynasty, but as a warning about ambition, a warning about unchecked power, a warning about institutions controlled by individuals, and perhaps most importantly, a warning about the difference between history and legend. Because sometimes the darkest stories are not entirely false. They are simply larger than the truth. And sometimes the truth is more complicated, more human, and more fascinating than the legend that replaced it. That was the world of Pope Alexander VI, the Pope behind the Borgia family. A man who climbed from provincial Spanish nobility to the highest office in Western Christendom. A father who turned his children into political instruments. A ruler who survived enemies, invasions, conspiracies, and scandal. and a historical figure whose name became permanently associated with the darkest side of the Renaissance. But now, after 5 centuries, the question is no longer simply whether Alexander was good or evil. The more important question is what his story reveals about power itself. Because power does not always belong to the strongest. It belongs to those who understand the system. Rodrigo understood it. He understood patience. He understood alliances. He understood money. He understood institutions. He understood fear. And for more than half a century, he used all of them, until finally the system he had mastered turned against his family. And that is where the story of Alexander VI truly ends. Not with poison, not with a secret conspiracy, not with a dramatic assassination, but with something far more ordinary. Time. A ruler grows old. A son loses his protector. Allies change sides. Enemies return. And the world moves on. The Borgia family could not stop that. No ruler could. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. Even the most powerful people in history eventually become stories told by strangers. Alexander became one of those stories. 500 years later, we are still telling it. And now we know why. But knowing why the Borgia story survived is only part of the story. The other question is what Alexander actually left behind. And when we look beyond the legends, his legacy becomes much larger than the reputation of one corrupt pope. Alexander ruled at a moment when the political map of Europe was being redrawn. France was becoming more powerful. Spain was becoming more powerful. The Holy Roman Empire remained a major force. Italy was divided among competing states. And the papacy was trying to survive in a world where kings increasingly possessed armies, money, and centralized governments of their own. The Pope could no longer rely only upon spiritual authority. He needed diplomacy. He needed territory. He needed alliances. And sometimes he needed soldiers. Alexander understood this reality. That does not excuse his actions, but it explains them. He was operating inside a political system that rewarded ambition. The men surrounding him were not innocent observers. Cardinals had their own families. Princes had their own armies. Kings used marriage as diplomacy. Nobles changed allegiance when circumstances changed. And church offices could provide enormous political and financial advantages. Alexander simply mastered the system more aggressively than many of his predecessors. That was both his strength and his weakness. Because the more successfully he used the system for his family, the more clearly his enemies could accuse him of abusing it. And there was another contradiction. Alexander was a pope at a time when the Catholic Church was itself under increasing pressure to reform. Criticism of clerical corruption was already widespread. Many Christians were disturbed by the wealth and behavior of some church officials. Humanist scholars were calling for greater intellectual and moral renewal. Preachers criticized the luxurious lifestyles of clergy. And throughout Europe, people were asking difficult questions about the relationship between spiritual authority and worldly power. Alexander's behavior did not create these problems, but his papacy made them impossible to ignore. He became a symbol. For critics of the Renaissance papacy, he represented the danger of a church leader becoming too deeply involved in politics. For defenders of the papacy, his reign could be placed within a much larger tradition of political struggle. But the debate continued long after his death. And then came Martin Luther. In 1517, only 14 years after Alexander's death, Luther publicly challenged important practices and teachings associated with the Catholic Church. The Reformation began. The religious unity of Western Europe fractured. New Protestant churches emerged. The Catholic Church responded with reform and eventually with the Council of Trent. The world of Alexander was disappearing. The political and religious environment that had produced him was being transformed. In that sense, Alexander stood at the end of an era. He belonged to the age of Renaissance popes. The popes who followed him would face a different Europe. Printing meant criticism could spread rapidly. Religious arguments could reach ordinary people. Political rulers could use religious divisions for their own purposes. And the authority of Rome would be challenged in ways that Alexander could scarcely have imagined. Yet the Renaissance itself reached one of its greatest artistic heights after Alexander. The Vatican became associated with some of the most extraordinary artistic projects in European history. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Raphael transformed the papal apartments. St. Peter's Basilica would eventually become one of the greatest architectural achievements in the world. The same papacy that had once been associated with the Borgias would become one of the greatest patrons of Renaissance culture. That creates another historical irony. The Renaissance papacy was capable of extraordinary artistic patronage and extraordinary political corruption at the same time. The two realities existed together. The same institution could commission masterpieces and engage in political intrigue. The same city could contain magnificent churches and brutal political violence. The same ruler could patronize culture while pursuing dynastic ambition. History does not separate these things neatly. They existed together. And that is why the Renaissance remains so fascinating. It was not a simple age of darkness giving way to enlightenment. It was a period of contradiction. Old institutions survived while new ideas appeared. Religious authority remained powerful while criticism increased. Monarchies became stronger while Italian states remained divided. Artists looked back toward classical antiquity while politicians fought modern wars with increasingly sophisticated weapons. Alexander lived inside that contradiction. He was a medieval pope with Renaissance ambitions. He used ancient religious traditions to justify political authority. He used modern diplomacy to protect old institutions. And he used his family to strengthen a position that was never supposed to become hereditary. The Borgia project therefore reveals something fundamental about Renaissance politics. Family was power. A powerful family could provide security. It could provide money. It could provide soldiers. It could create alliances. It could protect a ruler from enemies. But family could also become a weakness, because every relative had ambitions of their own. Every marriage created new obligations. Every son wanted advancement. Every daughter could become a diplomatic instrument. And every rival family saw the possibility of attacking the dynasty through one of its members. Alexander understood family politics better than almost anyone. But even he could not control every consequence. Cesare was ambitious enough to become dangerous. Lucrezia was forced through a series of political marriages. Giovanni was killed. Geoffrey remained politically less important. And after Alexander's death, the family could not maintain the same level of influence. This is perhaps the clearest proof that Alexander had not created a true dynasty. He had created a political moment, and political moments can disappear. The Borgia story also teaches us something about historical evidence. The closer we look, the more uncertain some of the famous stories become. Take the death of Alexander. The popular version says the Pope was poisoned. Sometimes the story claims that the poison was intended for someone else. Sometimes it is said that Cesare was also poisoned. Sometimes the story involves a dinner. But contemporary evidence suggests a more complicated picture. Alexander and Cesare became seriously ill in August 1503. Malaria was common in Rome. Other diseases were also present. The exact cause of Alexander's death remains uncertain. Poison cannot be completely excluded, but there is no reliable evidence proving the dramatic assassination scenario that later became popular. The same uncertainty surrounds the death of several people connected to the Borgias. That does not mean nothing suspicious happened. It means historians must distinguish suspicion from proof. This distinction is essential. A story repeated for 500 years does not become true simply because it is famous. A rumor written by an enemy does not become evidence merely because it is dramatic. And a legend does not become history simply because it appears in a novel. The Borgia family has suffered from this problem more than almost any other Renaissance dynasty. Their reputation became larger than their surviving evidence. And once a reputation becomes established, every new story tends to reinforce it. If a Borgia dies suddenly, people assume poison. If a marriage ends, people assume scandal. If Cesare orders an execution, people assume the darkest possible motive. If Lucrezia appears at a political gathering, later writers imagine secret plots. The legend becomes self-confirming. But historical research requires the opposite approach. We begin with the evidence. Then we ask what the evidence allows us to conclude. And sometimes the answer is simply, we do not know. That uncertainty can be frustrating, but it is also honest. And in the case of Alexander, uncertainty actually makes the story more interesting, because we are left with a man whose real actions were already extraordinary. We do not need imaginary poison to make him fascinating. We do not need invented murders. We do not need exaggerated sexual scandals. The historical record already gives us a powerful story. A cardinal from Valencia becomes pope. A pope promotes his children. A son abandons the church and becomes a military prince. A family attempts to create a territorial state in central Italy. Foreign monarchies intervene. Rivals conspire. Territories are conquered. Alliances collapse. The pope dies. The dynasty falls. And 5 centuries later, people are still arguing about what it all meant. That is enough. Perhaps the most important lesson is that Alexander was not simply an individual who corrupted an institution. He was also a product of an institution that had already become deeply political. The papacy controlled territory. The Pope appointed officials. The Pope negotiated treaties. The Pope participated in international politics. This was normal. What made Alexander controversial was the intensity with which he used those powers for his family. His enemies saw nepotism, and they were right. But nepotism was not invented by the Borgias. It had existed for centuries. The very word comes from the Latin word for nephew, because earlier popes frequently advanced nephews and relatives. The Borgias took this tradition to another level. Alexander's children became central to his political strategy. That made his nepotism especially visible. It also made his enemies especially determined to destroy his reputation. And they succeeded. The Borgia name became synonymous with corruption. But there is another side to the story. Alexander's papacy was not simply a period of decline. The administrative machinery of the papacy continued functioning. Diplomatic relationships continued. Church appointments continued. Political negotiations continued. Rome remained a major centre of European politics, and the papacy continued to play a central role in the international system. Alexander was therefore not a ruler who simply ignored his responsibilities. He was deeply involved in them. The problem was that he viewed many responsibilities through the lens of political survival, and political survival was always connected to family survival. This brings us back to the young Rodrigo who watched his uncle become pope. He learned a lesson early. Power can disappear. The protection of one pope can vanish with his death. A family can rise quickly and fall just as quickly. Rodrigo spent his life trying to prevent that. He became wealthy. He built alliances. He cultivated influence. He survived multiple papacies. And when he finally became pope, he tried to create something that would outlast him. His children would carry the family forward. His son would build a state. His daughter would create alliances. His relatives would occupy important positions. The Borgia name would become permanent. But history had other plans. Alexander could not control the future. No one can. The moment a ruler dies, every alliance is reconsidered. Every promise is renegotiated. Every enemy measures his opportunity. And every ambitious subordinate asks whether it is finally time to become independent. That is what happened after Alexander's death. The Borgia structure collapsed because it had been built around one person. The lesson is ancient. A state built entirely around a ruler is vulnerable. A dynasty built around one man's influence is fragile. And power borrowed from an institution can disappear when the institution changes hands. Cesare learned that lesson with his life. Alexander learned it with his death. Lucrezia survived it by adapting, and the Borgia name survived in a completely different way. Through memory, through scandal, through literature, through art, through popular culture. The family that wanted political permanence achieved cultural permanence instead. That may be the greatest irony of the entire story. Alexander wanted his descendants to rule. Instead, his descendants became historical figures. He wanted a dynasty. He created a legend. And legends can sometimes survive longer than kingdoms. Today, the places associated with the Borgias remain part of Italy's historical landscape. Palaces, churches, fortresses, roads, towers. The physical world of Renaissance Italy still exists in fragments. But the people are gone. The voices are gone. The negotiations are gone. The private fears are gone. What remains are documents and memories, and the task of history is to reconstruct a world from those fragments. Sometimes the evidence is clear, sometimes it is contradictory, sometimes it is silent. The silence can be as important as the evidence, because where the sources do not speak, historians must resist the temptation to invent. The Borgia story has taught generations of readers the opposite lesson. When there is a gap, fill it with poison. When there is a mystery, add a murder. When there is a scandal, make it darker. But the real Renaissance does not need embellishment. It was already a dangerous world. Kings invaded kingdoms. Nobles betrayed allies. Popes raised armies. Families fought for territory. Marriage determined political futures, and ordinary people often suffered the consequences. Behind every grand political decision were thousands of people who had little control over what happened. When armies marched, peasants lost crops. When cities were conquered, civilians faced uncertainty. When rulers changed alliances, merchants had to adapt. When wars destroyed roads, trade suffered. The great political games of Renaissance rulers were never merely games. They affected real lives. The Borgias were part of that world. Their story was not only about palaces and cardinals, it was also about the people living beneath them. And that is another reason the Borgia legend can be misleading. It turns history into a family drama. But Renaissance politics was much larger. The Borgias were one powerful family among many. They competed with the Orsini. They dealt with the Colonna. They negotiated with the Sforza. They interacted with the Medici. They faced the Della Rovere. They depended upon France. They watched Spain. They feared Venice. They negotiated with Naples. The family existed inside a massive network of competing interests. Alexander was powerful because he understood that network. But he was never its only player, and eventually the network moved beyond him. That is why his reign must be placed within the wider history of Renaissance Italy. The Borgias did not create the age. They emerged from it. They used its institutions. They exploited its opportunities. And they were eventually destroyed by its political instability. In that sense, Alexander was both master and prisoner of his age. He mastered the system better than many of his contemporaries. But he could not escape its rules. He could not make the papacy hereditary. He could not prevent foreign armies from entering Italy. He could not guarantee Cesar's future. He could not control the cardinals after his death. And he could not decide how history would remember him. That last power belonged to generations who came after him. And those generations were not kind. The Borgia legend grew. The facts became mixed with fiction. And eventually, the legend became more famous than the man. But perhaps now we can see Alexander more clearly, not as the perfect villain of a Renaissance thriller, not as an innocent victim of propaganda, but as a powerful, ambitious, deeply complicated Renaissance pope, a man who understood the machinery of power, a man who loved his family and used them, a man who strengthened the papacy while weakening its moral reputation, a man who created extraordinary opportunities for his children, and a man whose political achievements collapsed soon after his death. His story is not a simple morality tale. It is a study of ambition, and ambition is rarely simple. People want power because they fear losing it. They build alliances because they fear isolation. They accumulate wealth because they fear poverty. They strengthen families because they fear vulnerability. And sometimes, in trying to protect themselves, they create the very enemies they fear. That may have been Alexander's greatest mistake. The more he strengthened the Borgias, the more other families feared them. The more territory Cesare conquered, the more enemies he created. The more Alexander promoted his children, the more clearly his opponents could attack him. And the stronger the Borgia family appeared, the greater the satisfaction when it finally collapsed. Their rise was spectacular. Their fall was inevitable, but their memory was permanent. And that is where our understanding of Alexander VI should finally settle, between the evidence and the legend, between the Pope and the politician, between the father and the strategist, between the patron and the corrupt ruler, between the historical man and the myth created around him. The truth is not as simple as the stories, but it is far more interesting. Because Alexander did not need to be a monster to become dangerous. He only needed to be a powerful man operating in a system that rewarded ambition. And he was extraordinarily good at it. That is why, more than 5 centuries later, the name Alexander VI still carries such power. Not because every terrible thing ever said about him was true, but because the real story contains enough ambition, enough political violence, enough family intrigue, and enough historical consequence to keep the questions alive. And perhaps the final judgment belongs not to the legends, but to the evidence. A pope rose from the Spanish nobility. He reached the highest office of the Catholic Church. He transformed his family into a major political force. He helped shape the balance of power in Renaissance Italy. His son became a model of political ambition. His daughter became one of the most famous women of the Renaissance. And when Alexander died, the structure he had built began to disappear. The Borgia kingdom never became permanent. But the Borgia story did. And sometimes, in history, that is the strangest victory of all. The story of Alexander VI does not end with the fall of the Borgia family. It ends with a question. What remains when power disappears? For Alexander, the answer was not the kingdom he had hoped to create. It was not a permanent Borgia dynasty. It was not a political empire stretching across Italy. Instead, what remained was memory. And memory can be more difficult to control than territory. The Borgia family had once controlled armies, cities, marriages, appointments, and enormous sums of money. But they could not control what future generations would say about them. Their enemies had the first opportunity to tell the story, and they told it in the darkest possible way. Alexander became the corrupt pope. Cesare became the ruthless murderer. Lucrezia became the poisoner. The Vatican became the setting for secret crimes. And the Borgia name became a symbol of Renaissance decadence. But when historians returned to the surviving evidence, the picture became more complicated. Alexander was undoubtedly ambitious. He was undoubtedly involved in nepotism. He undoubtedly used the papacy to strengthen his family. But the most dramatic accusations against him cannot all be proven. That distinction matters, because history is not a contest to determine whether someone was completely good or completely evil. History asks what people actually did, why they did it, what choices were available to them, what pressures surrounded them, and what consequences followed. Alexander lived in a dangerous political world. Italy was divided. Foreign armies repeatedly crossed the peninsula. French kings claimed territories. Spanish rulers pursued their own interests. Italian families fought each other. The papal states needed military protection, and the Pope himself was a territorial ruler. Within that environment, political violence was not unusual. What was unusual was the scale of Alexander's family ambitions. He did not simply protect relatives. He attempted to transform them into a political dynasty. Caesar was the central instrument. Lucrezia became part of the diplomatic strategy. Other relatives received positions. The Borgia network expanded. For several years, it appeared that the family might succeed. Caesar's victories in Romagna were particularly impressive. He had conquered territory that had resisted papal authority for generations. He had defeated powerful local rulers. He had created a more centralized administration. And he had demonstrated that a pope's son could become a serious military and political force. But there was a hidden weakness. Caesar's state was not independent. Its resources were connected to his father. Its legitimacy was connected to the papacy. Its diplomatic position depended on foreign alliances. Its military strength depended upon money, and money depended upon political power. Remove Alexander, and the entire structure became unstable. That is exactly what happened. The death of Alexander created a vacuum. Julius II filled it, and Julius had no reason to preserve the Borgia project. The new pope moved quickly. Caesar's enemies returned. The territories he had conquered were reclaimed. The political alliances surrounding him dissolved. The great Borgia experiment was over. It had lasted only a few years, but its consequences were enormous. Cesare's career influenced political thinkers. Lucrezia became part of Renaissance cultural history. Alexander became one of the most controversial popes ever to sit on the throne of St. Peter. and the family became a permanent symbol of the dangerous combination of religion and political ambition. But perhaps the most important legacy was institutional. The Borgia experience contributed to a growing awareness of the weaknesses within Renaissance church politics. The papacy could not remain indefinitely dependent on the personalities of individual rulers. It needed stronger institutions. It needed reform. And Europe was moving toward a crisis in which questions about corruption, authority, and church leadership would become impossible to ignore. When Martin Luther challenged Rome in the 16th century, he was entering a world that had been shaped by decades of criticism. Alexander's papacy was only one part of that story, but his reputation made him an easy symbol. A corrupt pope became a convenient example. The reality was broader. The problems of the church did not begin with Alexander. They did not end with him. They were structural. The Renaissance papacy was deeply involved in European politics. Popes had territories. Popes had armies. Popes had diplomatic interests. Popes had families. And the line between spiritual authority and political authority was often difficult to define. Alexander simply became the most famous example of the contradiction. That is why his name survived. But there is another reason. The Borgias understood spectacle. Their world was filled with ceremony. Papal processions, royal marriages, military triumphs, diplomatic receptions, religious ceremonies, public executions, grand banquets. The Renaissance was an age in which appearance mattered. Power had to be seen. A ruler who looked weak invited enemies. A ruler who appeared strong could discourage rebellion. Alexander understood this. Cesare understood it even more clearly. When Cesare entered a city, he wanted people to see power. When he conquered a territory, he wanted the victory to become part of his reputation. When he punished an enemy, he wanted the punishment to communicate a message. Politics was theatre, but the theatre could become reality. A population that believed a ruler was powerful could become less willing to resist him. An enemy who believed an army was stronger than it really was might surrender. A diplomat who believed an alliance was stable might make a different decision. Reputation was therefore a form of power. Caesar's reputation as a ruthless commander sometimes helped him, but it also created fear. And fear has limits. It can produce obedience, but it can also produce conspiracies. The men who joined the Magione conspiracy had already learned that lesson. They believed Caesar's ambitions threatened them. They decided that they had to act before he became too powerful. Caesar survived that crisis, but his enemies never disappeared. The Senigallia episode demonstrated his ability to defeat conspirators, yet it also created another historical problem. Later writers used the event as proof of his treachery. The same action could therefore be interpreted in two completely different ways. To Caesar, it may have been necessary political survival. To his enemies, it was betrayal. To Machiavelli, it was a case study in political calculation. To later generations, it became part of the legend of Borgia cruelty. This is why context matters. The same event can look completely different depending upon the perspective of the observer. History is full of such contradictions, and the Borgias are one of the clearest examples. Even Alexander's relationship with his children requires nuance. He clearly promoted them. But promotion was not necessarily the same as blind affection. Renaissance rulers often viewed children as political assets. A son could become a military commander. A daughter could become the wife of an important ruler. A relative could receive a church office. Family connections created political security. Alexander was following a familiar political pattern. What made his behavior controversial was the extraordinary level of influence he gave his family. And because the Pope was supposed to represent the universal church, the appearance of family favoritism was especially damaging. This is where Alexander's personal story becomes an institutional story. The Pope was not merely a private man. His decisions affected millions of people. When he advanced his children, he was using the authority of a global institution. That created the perception that the church itself had become a vehicle for private ambition. Whether or not every accusation was true, the perception was powerful, and perceptions can change history. The Borgia family therefore became a warning about what happens when private ambition becomes intertwined with public authority. That warning remains relevant far beyond Renaissance Italy. Every institution faces the same danger. When leaders confuse personal interest with institutional interest, trust begins to disappear. Alexander's reign demonstrates how quickly that can happen. He may have believed that strengthening his family strengthened his position, but the opposite also became true. The more closely the papacy became associated with the Borgias, the more vulnerable the papacy became to criticism of the Borgias. His personal reputation became the institution's reputation, and when the family fell, part of the institution's credibility suffered with it. That is one of the deepest lessons of his reign. Power does not exist in isolation. A ruler's choices can strengthen an institution, or they can make the institution dependent upon the ruler. Alexander chose the second path, and after his death, the consequences were visible. Yet the papacy survived. Rome survived. The Catholic Church survived. The Renaissance continued, and the Borgia family became a historical memory. That survival is important, because it reminds us that institutions are often stronger than individuals. Alexander could shape the papacy, but he could not become the papacy. He could use the office. He could influence it. He could transform its political relationships. But when he died, another man took the same office. The institution continued. The individual disappeared. That is the difference between power and permanence. Alexander possessed enormous power. He did not achieve permanence. His family did not rule Rome. His son did not inherit the papal throne. His territories did not become a hereditary Borgia kingdom. His political system collapsed. But his story remained. And perhaps that is why the Borgia family continues to attract attention. There is something deeply human about their rise and fall. They wanted security. They wanted status. They wanted protection. They wanted their children to succeed. They wanted enemies to disappear. They wanted their family name to survive. Those desires are not unique. What made them extraordinary was the amount of power available to them. They lived at the highest levels of Renaissance politics. Their private decisions could become international events. A marriage could change an alliance. A death could change the balance of power. A papal appointment could transform a family fortune. A military victory could change the map. The Borgias were therefore not simply a family. For a brief moment, they became a political system, and then that system collapsed. But the world continued. After the Borgias came new popes, new wars, new alliances, new artists, new ideas. The Renaissance moved forward, and eventually Europe entered the Reformation. The old political world was slowly replaced, but the memory of Alexander remained trapped in the old world. He became the last great symbol of the Renaissance papacy before Europe entered a period of religious transformation. His name became associated with the moment when the papacy appeared to be both a sacred institution and a secular monarchy. That contradiction would eventually become harder to sustain. The church would reform. The papacy would change. The political map of Europe would change. And the meaning of religious authority would change with it. But Alexander could not see any of that. He died before the Great Crisis. He never witnessed Luther's challenge. He never saw the Catholic Reformation. He never saw the later artistic achievements of the papacy. He never knew how historians would judge him. He only knew the world he lived in, and in that world he believed power had to be protected. He protected it through diplomacy, through money, through family, through alliances, and when necessary, through force. That strategy worked for many years. Then it failed. And that is perhaps the simplest summary of his life. He was extraordinarily successful until the circumstances changed. When the circumstances changed, the system he built could not adapt quickly enough. Caesar tried, but he was already weakened. Lucrezia adapted in another way. She built a new life in Ferrara. The Borgia name gradually disappeared from the center of European politics, but it never disappeared from history. Centuries later, writers rediscovered the family. They found a story that seemed perfectly suited to the imagination. A pope, a prince, a beautiful duchess, a palace, a conspiracy, a poison, a murder, a secret. And so the legend returned. But now we can separate the legend from the evidence. Alexander was not innocent. He was not the devil either. He was a Renaissance pope who used extraordinary political power for personal and dynastic purposes. That is enough. Caesar was not a supernatural villain. He was a talented and ruthless political commander whose achievements depended heavily on his father's position. Lucrezia was not the murderous poisoner of popular legend. She was a woman born into political power who endured a series of difficult marriages before establishing herself at the Este court. And the Borgia family was not an unstoppable dynasty. It was a powerful family that rose quickly and collapsed quickly. Their story is therefore not a story of permanent conquest. It is a story of temporary power. And temporary power is one of history's oldest themes. Kings die, empires fall, families disappear, institutions survive, and stories remain. The Borgia story survived because it speaks to something universal, the desire for power, the fear of losing it, the willingness to sacrifice morality for security, the temptation to use institutions for personal advantage, and the human fascination with scandal. But perhaps the greatest lesson is simpler. Power creates consequences that cannot always be controlled. Alexander strengthened Caesar. Caesar created enemies. Those enemies created conspiracies. The conspiracies created executions. The executions created legends. And the legends created the Borgia reputation that survives today. One decision creates another. One generation creates the reputation inherited by the next. History is built from chains of consequences. Alexander could control many things. He could not control the chain after his death. And that is where his real story ends. Not in a secret chamber, not beside a poisoned cup, not beneath the walls of a conquered city, but in the quiet realization that every political empire has an ending. The Borgia family had reached the highest levels of Renaissance power. Then it was gone. What remained were buildings, letters, records, paintings, rumours, and names. Alexander, Caesar, Lucrezia, Borgia, those names became symbols, but they were once living people. People who woke each morning without knowing how history would remember them. People who made decisions without knowing which decisions would become famous. People who believed they were shaping the future. And perhaps they were, just not in the way they expected. Alexander wanted to create a dynasty. He created a legend. Caesar wanted to build a state. He created a political reputation that influenced Machiavelli. Lucrezia was used to create alliances. She became remembered as one of the most fascinating women of the Renaissance. Their political ambitions faded. Their historical significance did not. And so, 5 centuries later, the Borgia family still stands at the crossroads of religion, politics, family, violence, and memory. Their story forces us to look beyond simple judgments. It asks us to distinguish fact from rumour, power from legitimacy, ambition from achievement, and reputation from reality. Alexander VI remains controversial because there is no single sentence that can contain him. He was a pope, a politician, a father, a patron, a strategist, a Renaissance prince in everything but name, and ultimately a man whose greatest political project died with him. That is the paradox of Alexander. He spent his life trying to make his family impossible to ignore, and he succeeded. But he could not make them impossible to defeat. The Borgia family disappeared from the centre of power. The papacy moved on. Italy changed. Europe changed. Religion changed. The Renaissance ended. The modern world began. And Alexander remained behind, trapped in history. A man remembered more for the rumours surrounding him than for many of the decisions he actually made. But perhaps that is why his story still matters. Because history is not only about what people did, it is also about what people believe they did. And the distance between those two things can become enormous. The real Alexander may never be completely recovered. The legend will always remain. But somewhere between the two is the historical man. A powerful pope who understood politics. A father who used his family to strengthen his position. A ruler who helped reshape Renaissance Italy. A man whose ambitions exceeded the limits of the system he controlled. And a figure whose fall demonstrated the temporary nature of personal power. The Borgias rose. The Borgias fell. The legend remained. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the shaded past. History does not preserve everyone equally. Some people disappear completely. Others become symbols. Alexander became a symbol of ambition without restraint, a symbol of political religion, a symbol of the Renaissance at its most brilliant and its most troubling. But if we look beyond the myth, we discover something more valuable than a monster. We discover a human being, and human beings are always more complicated than legends. That is where the story ends, not with certainty, not with a perfect verdict, but with an understanding. Alexander VI was neither the saint his office demanded nor the monster later generations imagined. He was a product of his time. He mastered its politics. He exploited its weaknesses. He built an extraordinary family machine, and then watched, through the final years of his life, as that machine became increasingly dependent upon him. When he died, it collapsed. His son could not save it. His enemies reclaimed it. His daughter moved into another life, and the Borgia dynasty disappeared. But the name survived. 5 centuries later, it still carries the echo of Renaissance Rome, the echo of papal power, the echo of political ambition, the echo of a family that tried to turn the church into the foundation of a dynasty, and the echo of a question that history asks again and again. How much power is too much? Alexander never found the answer. Perhaps no ruler ever does, because power rarely announces the moment when it becomes dangerous. It simply grows. One appointment, one alliance, one victory, one marriage, one compromise, one enemy removed, then another, until eventually the ruler looks around and discovers that everything depends upon him. That was Alexander's world, and that was the world he left behind. The Borgia story is therefore not merely a story about one pope. It is a story about the human desire to control the future. Alexander tried to control the future through his children. He failed. But his attempt became one of the most enduring stories of the Renaissance. And now, centuries later, the final image is not of a poisoned cup. It is of Rome itself. The city remains. The churches remain. The streets remain. The walls remain. The history remains. But the voices of the Borgias are gone. Only their story remains. And history, unlike power, has no need for armies. It only needs someone willing to remember. The Borgia family wanted to rule the future. Instead, they became part of the past. And that is why Pope Alexander VI still stands in the shadows of Renaissance history. Not because every legend is true, but because behind the legend was a real man who reached extraordinary heights, made extraordinary choices, and left behind consequences that lasted far beyond his lifetime. The Pope is gone. The dynasty is gone. The Renaissance is gone. But the story remains. There is one final way to understand Alexander VI. Not through the rumors, not through the legends, not through the image of a pope surrounded by poison, murder, and secret plots, but through the simple fact that he understood power. Alexander understood that the papacy was one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. He understood that Rome was not merely a religious capital, it was a political capital. He understood that Italy was divided because no single power was strong enough to dominate the peninsula permanently. He understood that France and Spain were entering Italy because they saw opportunity. And he understood that a ruler without allies was vulnerable. So he built alliances. He built wealth. He built influence. And above all, he built around his family. That decision changed everything. Because the moment Alexander turned his children into instruments of policy, the Borgia family became more than a family. It became a political project. Caesar represented military power. Lucrezia represented diplomatic connection. Other relatives represented offices and influence. And Alexander himself provided the authority that connected them all. For a few extraordinary years, the project seemed to work. Cesare conquered territory. The Borgia influence expanded. Their enemies were frightened. Their allies were rewarded. Their name became increasingly powerful. But the entire structure contained one weakness. It depended upon Alexander, When Alexander died, the political machine lost its center, and without its center, the machine could not survive. That is why the fall of the Borgias was so rapid. The family had not created a kingdom with institutions strong enough to protect it. They had created a network of personal relationships. Those relationships lasted only as long as people believed the Borgias could reward or punish them. Once that belief disappeared, loyalty disappeared with it. This is the fundamental difference between power and authority. Power can force people to obey. Authority can make them continue obeying when the powerful person is gone. Alexander possessed enormous power, but the Borgia family never developed lasting authority. That is why Julius II could dismantle their influence, and that is why the Borgia territories could be recovered so quickly. The dynasty was never truly established. It was an extraordinary political experiment, and it failed. Yet Alexander's failure does not make his career insignificant. Quite the opposite. His reign reveals how unstable Renaissance politics could be. It shows how quickly a family could rise. It shows how marriage could become diplomacy. It shows how religion and politics could become intertwined. It shows how military power could transform the balance between local rulers. And it shows how reputation could become a weapon. The Borgias were attacked not only with armies, they were attacked with stories. Their enemies understood that destroying a reputation could be almost as useful as defeating an army. And those stories survived. 5 centuries later, we are still dealing with them. But now we can see something the original storytellers could not. We can compare different sources. We can examine documents. We can identify contradictions. We can separate contemporary accusations from later inventions. And when we do that, the Borgia story becomes more human. Alexander was ambitious. He was politically calculating. He practiced nepotism. He used his children. He was deeply involved in international politics. He was not the ideal spiritual leader that later generations might have wanted. But he was also not the supernatural villain created by popular legend. Caesar was ruthless, but he was also capable of administration. Lucrezia was surrounded by scandal, but her later life demonstrates that she was far more complex than the poisonous temptress of fiction. The family was neither completely innocent nor completely monstrous. They were Renaissance political actors, and that may be the most important conclusion. The past does not need to be turned into fantasy. Reality is already dramatic. Imagine Rome in the final years of the 15th century. The Vatican filled with diplomats, cardinals calculating alliances, foreign ambassadors watching every decision, Italian families defending their territories, French armies crossing the Alps, Spanish power expanding, and at the center of it all, an aging pope attempting to secure the future of his family. His son is becoming a military prince. His daughter is being married into powerful families. His enemies are organizing. His allies are negotiating. And every decision could change the political balance of Italy. This was Alexander's world, and it was a world where uncertainty was permanent. No alliance lasted forever. No territory was completely secure. No marriage guaranteed peace. No ruler could assume that today's ally would remain tomorrow's ally. In such a world, Alexander's instinct for survival made sense. But survival had a price. The more aggressively he pursued security, the more enemies he created. The more he promoted Cesare, the more powerful Cesare became. The more powerful Cesare became, the more frightened his enemies became. The more frightened they became, the more likely they were to conspire. And every conspiracy justified another act of repression. The cycle continued. Power produced fear. Fear produced resistance. Resistance produced violence. Violence produced hatred. And hatred produced the legends that survived long after the political system disappeared. That cycle is one of the most important things the Borgia story teaches us. Power can create the enemies that eventually destroy it. Alexander may have believed that greater power would make his family safer, but greater power also made his family more threatening. The Borgias became a target precisely because they seemed capable of becoming too powerful. Their success created the coalition that ultimately defeated them. This is why Caesar's fall was not simply bad luck. His position was structurally vulnerable. He had enemies among Italian nobles. He depended on French support. He needed papal money. He depended upon his father's health, and he had no guaranteed succession. The death of Alexander, therefore, did not create the weakness. It exposed the weakness that had always been there. That is an important distinction. Alexander's political system was fragile before he died. His death simply revealed how fragile it really was. And perhaps Alexander himself understood this. He had spent his entire life watching political fortunes change. He knew that papal power was temporary. He knew that alliances shifted. He knew that families rose and fell. That may explain the urgency with which he tried to strengthen Caesar. He wanted to solve the problem of succession before it became a problem, but he could not solve it. The papacy was not hereditary. The political structure of Italy was too unstable, and Caesar's own ambitions were too dependent upon circumstances outside his control. So the dream ended, not with one dramatic betrayal, not with one final assassination, but with the slow collapse of a system that had never been as permanent as it appeared. And perhaps that is why Alexander remains so interesting. He was not simply a villain. He was a man trying to solve a problem that no amount of personal power could fully solve. How do you make temporary authority permanent? How do you protect your family after you are gone? How do you turn personal influence into institutional power? Alexander tried. He failed. But the attempt changed Renaissance Italy, and the consequences lasted for generations. The story of the Borgias also reminds us that women in Renaissance politics were often underestimated. Lucrezia is perhaps the clearest example. For years, she was described primarily through the men around her: her father, her brothers, her husbands, her political marriages. But Lucrezia eventually developed her own position at Ferrara. She became part of a sophisticated court. She developed relationships with artists and intellectuals. She became a patron. She managed household and political responsibilities. She experienced repeated pregnancies and personal losses. And she built a life that continued after the collapse of her family's power. Her survival is important because it challenges the idea that every Borgia story ended in violence. Not every member of the family died in a conspiracy. Not every relationship ended in murder. Not every Borgia was a criminal. History is more complicated than the legend. Lucrezia's life is a reminder of that, and it also shows the limits placed upon women of her time. Her marriages were political decisions. Her personal choices were constrained. Her reputation could be damaged by rumors she could not control, and centuries later, writers continued to define her through those rumors. Her story demonstrates how historical memory can be unfair. A woman can be remembered for accusations while the evidence tells a much more complicated story. The same is true of Alexander. His reputation became fixed. Once the image of the corrupt Borgia Pope had been created, later generations often searched for evidence that confirmed it. Contradictory evidence was easier to ignore. This is how historical myths survive. They are repeated. They are simplified. They are dramatized. And eventually, they become familiar enough to feel true. But familiarity is not proof. That is why the real story requires patience. It requires separating what we know from what we suspect. And sometimes it requires admitting that we will never know everything. That is not a weakness of history. It is one of its strengths. History teaches us to live with uncertainty. Alexander's death is a perfect example. The exact cause remains debated. The dramatic poison story is famous. But fame is not evidence. The same applies to many stories surrounding the Borgias. Some may contain fragments of truth. Others are probably exaggerations. Some were invented, and some may never be resolved. The honest historian does not force certainty where the evidence does not provide it. Instead, the historian asks a different question. What can we say with confidence? We can say that Alexander was a powerful pope. We can say that he promoted his family. We can say that Caesar became a major military and political figure. We can say that the Borgias attempted to build territorial power in central Italy. We can say that they faced powerful opposition. We can say that Alexander's death weakened Caesar dramatically. We can say that Julius II dismantled much of the Borgia political position. And we can say that the family did not establish the permanent dynasty Alexander had hoped for. Those facts alone tell an extraordinary story. There is no need to add fictional poison rings, no need to invent secret chambers, no need to transform Lucrezia into a murderess, no need to make Cesare into a supernatural villain. The real Renaissance was already full of ambition and danger, and the Borgia family was already at its centre. When we look at the wider world, their importance becomes even clearer. The age of Alexander was an age of transition. The medieval world was fading. Centralized monarchies were becoming stronger. Italy was becoming the battlefield of European powers. The printing press was transforming communication. The Atlantic voyages were transforming Europe's understanding of the world. Humanism was changing intellectual life. Art was reaching new heights. And religious criticism was becoming increasingly powerful. Alexander lived at the crossroads of all these changes. He was both part of the old world and a participant in the new one. He used traditional papal authority, but he also used modern diplomacy. He relied upon family alliances, but he operated in an increasingly international political system. He supported traditional religious institutions, but his personal behavior contributed to criticism of those institutions. That contradiction defines his reign, and perhaps that is why the title of this story matters. The Pope behind the Borgia family. Because Alexander was not merely a member of the family, he was the force behind its rise. Without him, there would have been no Borgia political project on the same scale. His authority gave Cesare opportunities. His diplomacy created alliances. His papal office created resources. His decisions shaped Lucrezia's political future. He was the centre. And when the centre disappeared, everything changed. That is why his death was the decisive moment. Not because the legend says he was poisoned, not because of the mystery surrounding his final illness, but because his death exposed the true nature of Borgia power. It was personal, and personal power dies with the person who possesses it. Cesare could not inherit the papacy. He could not command the cardinals. He could not force the next pope to continue his father's policies. He could not recreate Alexander's authority. His great project therefore collapsed, and that collapse is perhaps more significant than his rise, because it demonstrates the limits of even extraordinary political talent. Cesare could conquer cities. He could defeat enemies. He could manipulate alliances. But he could not defeat succession. He could not defeat time. And he could not defeat the institutional rules of the papacy. Eventually, history moved beyond him. That is the final irony. The man who wanted to control the future became a prisoner of the past. Today, Cesare is remembered largely because Machiavelli wrote about him. Lucrezia is remembered because of the legends surrounding her. Alexander is remembered because his papacy became a symbol. The family survived through history, not through power. And that may be the strangest form of immortality. Alexander wanted his name to dominate Italy. Instead, his name dominates a chapter of Renaissance history. He wanted his children to rule. Instead, his children became subjects of historical study. He wanted to control his reputation. Instead, his enemies and later writers helped shape it. He wanted to create a dynasty. Instead, he created a legend. That is where the Borgia story finally leads. Not toward a simple judgment, but toward an understanding of how history is made. People make decisions. Their enemies interpret those decisions. Their supporters defend them. Writers repeat them. Later generations reshape them. And eventually, the original reality becomes difficult to see. The job of history is to look through that fog. Sometimes the view is clear. Sometimes it is not. But every generation gets another opportunity to ask the question. Who was Alexander VI? He was a Spanish-born Renaissance pope. He was an experienced church politician. He was a father who openly advanced his children. He was a diplomat who dealt with kings. He was a political ruler who supported military campaigns. He was a patron operating within a great cultural age. He was controversial during his own lifetime, and he became legendary after his death. He was neither the saint his office symbolized, nor the monster of later fiction. He was a man, a very powerful man, a deeply ambitious man, a man whose choices changed the lives of people around him, and a man who ultimately discovered that no amount of power can control the future forever. The Borgia family is gone, The political world that created them is gone. The Renaissance itself is gone. But the questions remain. How should religious leaders use political power? How much family influence is too much? When does ambition become corruption? How much should we trust hostile historical sources? And how do we separate a person's real actions from the mythology built around them? These are not only questions about Alexander, they are questions about history itself. And that is why the story still matters. Because the past is not simply a collection of dead people. It is a mirror. It shows us what human beings do when they have power. It shows us what fear can produce. It shows us how institutions can be manipulated. And it shows us how easily truth can become legend. Alexander VI stands inside that mirror. Behind him is medieval Rome. Ahead of him is the modern world. Around him are kings, cardinals, soldiers, artists, diplomats, merchants, nobles, and ordinary people. Above him is the papal throne. Beside him are his children, and beyond them lies a Europe preparing for transformation. For a brief moment, the Borgia family stood at the center of that world. Then history moved on. The family could not stop it. No family could. No pope could. No king could. The world keeps moving, and when it moves, power changes hands. Alexander's hands finally became empty. Caesar's armies disappeared. Lucrezia's political life changed. The Borgia name faded from the corridors of power. But their story remained, and perhaps that is enough. Because in the end, every ruler leaves something behind. Some leave territory. Some leave institutions. Some leave monuments. Some leave destruction. Alexander left a question. Was the man behind the legend as terrible as the legend says? The evidence suggests something more complicated. He was ambitious. He was politically aggressive. He practiced nepotism. He used family connections. He made decisions that harmed opponents. But he also operated within a political culture where such behavior was common. His uniqueness was not that he invented political corruption. It was that he combined the powers of the papacy with unusually ambitious family politics. That combination made him unforgettable. And that is why the Borgia family continues to fascinate historians. Their story sits at the intersection of religion and politics, family and state, truth and propaganda, power and memory. And perhaps no single figure represents that intersection better than Alexander himself. He became pope. He became father. He became political strategist. He became patron. And finally, he became legend. The man died in 1503, but the legend never did. 5 centuries later, we are still looking back at the shadows of Renaissance Rome, still examining the documents, still debating the rumors, still trying to understand the choices, still asking whether the stories are true. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Borgia family. The past is never completely silent. It speaks through evidence. It speaks through memory. It speaks through buildings and letters. It speaks through stories. But sometimes the loudest voice is not the most accurate one. The darkest story is not always the truest, and the most famous legend is not always the best history. The real Alexander was complicated. The real Borgias were complicated. The real Renaissance was complicated. And that complexity is exactly what makes their story worth remembering. Alexander wanted to control history. He could not. History controlled him instead. His enemies gave him a reputation. His children gave him a legacy. His papacy gave him significance, and time gave him immortality of a very different kind. Not the immortality of a dynasty, not the immortality of a kingdom, but the immortality of a story about a pope, a family, a renaissance, and the dangerous pursuit of power. The Borgia family wanted to become the future. Instead, they became the past. And the past is where they will remain, forever remembered, forever debated, forever surrounded by shadows. And somewhere inside those shadows stands Alexander VI, the Pope behind the Borgia family. Not a monster, not a saint, but a man who reached the highest point of power available to him and discovered that even the highest throne could not protect his family from time. That is the final chapter of the Borgia story. The Pope is gone. The prince is gone. The Duchess is gone, the dynasty is gone, the Renaissance is gone, but the story remains. And perhaps that is the most enduring power of all. Not the power to rule, not the power to command, not the power to conquer, but the power to be remembered.